Okay, so today we're going to talk about macromolecules. And I'd gone over the objectives beforehand in the introduction to macromolecules, but I want to go over them just real quick. Hold on just a second. Okay, so our first standard is to distinguish between proteins, lipids, carbohydrates, and nucleic acids. And that's really what we're going to be going over in this unit. We're going to identify and distinguish between the proteins, lipids, nucleic acids, and carbohydrates. Hopefully, you've already completed your vocabulary assignment and you know kind of what we're talking about right now. If you don't know exactly what a carbohydrate is, but you have a faint idea, well, then you're in good shape. But if you have no idea what a carbohydrate or a protein or a nucleic acid are, then maybe you want to review your vocabulary words before you go through this PowerPoint. And we're going to distinguish between them in very different ways. And what distinguish means is we're going to be able to tell them apart. We want to be able to tell them apart based on their function, based on what elements they contain, based on their monomers and polymers. And hopefully these words are familiar to you, but we're going to go over them briefly in this PowerPoint. First off, I would like you guys to look at these foods here. Okay, so we have apples, grapes, asparagus, olive oil, butter, chicken. Take a minute and group those as either a carbohydrate, lipid, or protein. You might want to pause your screen so that you can look at these and then play when you need to go. I'm going to go ahead and move on. Okay, so the main components of all living cells are carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur. These are elements. Hopefully, in 8th grade, you guys went over what an element is. An element is one of it's a type of atom. It's one of the purest forms of an atom. And here we have carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur. And these are what make us up. These are what make up cells. These are what make up all things that are considered to be living. And previously, you guys learned what is considered to be living. Okay, so inside every cell is a concentrated mixture of different macromolecules. And just to clarify, these macromolecules are made up of these types of elements: carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen. And all these macromolecules are just large molecules forming a variety of specialized structures that carry out cellular functions. Okay, so we take these macromolecules, which are made up of those elements, and all a macromolecule is a large molecule. All a molecule is are these atoms bonded together, and they're arranged in these cells to carry out energy production, transport, waste disposal, synthesis of new molecules, storage of genetic information. These are all functions of these macromolecules, and they're what make up cells and what make up living individuals. So here we're going to talk about organic compounds. Okay, so in order for a compound to be considered organic, that compound has to contain carbon. Macromolecules are just large organic molecules. Inorganic molecules do not contain carbon, such as H2O or sodium chloride, which is salt. They do not contain carbon, and they're considered to be inorganic because of that. Macromolecules. Okay, so like I said before, they're large organic molecules. They're also called polymers, and they're made up of smaller building blocks called monomers. And our four examples of this are carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. Now, you guys should have, gotten some vocabulary in, but when I like to talk about monomers, I like to talk about a monomer as being like one Lego, okay? And you would take those Legos and you would stack, if you built them into a stack, they would be a polymer. So like a stack of Legos would be a polymer. Okay, so when we talk about carbohydrates, we can talk about three types of carbohydrates. We can talk about monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides. Our monosaccharides are smaller sugar molecules, and our polysaccharides are larger sugar molecules. All monosaccharide is one sugar unit, and you see it right here. This is just one sugar unit, okay? Glucose, which is found in your blood. This is your blood sugar. Deoxyribose and ribose we'll talk about later on in this semester, but those are sugars found in our DNA and RNA. Galactose, which is a milk sugar, and fructose, which is it's actually found in fruit. A disaccharide is actually two sugar units linked together, and here we see, oh, here's one sugar unit and here's another sugar unit. We're going to bond those two together. Examples of this is sucrose, which is table sugar, and all table sugar is glucose and fructose bonded together. And then our third type of sugar is a polysaccharide, which are many sugar units linked together, and you can see them. There's a bunch down here. Poly meaning many, and saccharide meaning many. Saccharide is just a fancy word for sugar. Examples of these are starch, glycogen, cellulose, chitin. Every word on there probably except for starch is something that you're not familiar with, and that's okay. Starch, I'm sure you've heard about, people talk a lot about breads and potatoes and pastas having lots of starch in them, and that's why, because they're composed of starch. Glycogen is beef muscle. Cellulose, and they put a lettuce and corn. Cellulose is actually, and you guys should have heard, cell walls before now. Cellulose actually compose cell walls. And chitin, those make up the exoskeletons of insects. So if you've ever, picked up a beetle and you felt that hard shell that they have, that's their exoskeleton, and that's called chitin. Okay, so just to recap, in case you didn't pick this up before, a carbohydrate, its monomer, or its, one Lego, or its building block is one sugar unit, and we call that a monosaccharide. When we stack a bunch of them together, a polymer would be many sugar units or a polysaccharide together. Now, don't get confused, because some students still are like, well, why is a monosaccharide still a carbohydrate? Well, it's still classified as a monosaccharide. And also, you can have trisaccharides and so on, but we're just going to talk about mono, di, and polysaccharide. The primary function of a carbohydrate molecule is to provide energy. And sometimes it'll store energy, but I want you guys to know that the primary function is a quick source of energy for us. It provides energy for our bodies or for the cell. A lot of times, I'm sure you've heard of um, athletes. They like to carb load, um, so they'll eat lots of starches and such before a big game, and that's to give them a source of energy for the big game. It's also used for structural purposes in plants. An example is cellulose. It is used to make cell walls in plants. So, like I said before, um, the cellulose makes up a cell wall. And then carbohydrates contain the following elements. They contain hydrogen, carbon, and oxygen in a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. Okay, so make sure you write that down because that's very important. We're not going to talk about it just right now, but make sure you know that they contain it in a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. Okay, so now we're going to talk about lipids. And lipids are used to store energy. They are also they can be used for insulation and protection, and they do not mix well in water. These are um, three big things about lipids. Remember that lipids store the most energy, okay? So carbohydrates can and they will, but lipids are a main source of energy storage. Lipids, that's their primary function. And here are some examples of lipids. When we talk about fats, um, oils, waxes, those are very common to you, and I would probably write those examples down right now and go at those. But also, we're going to talk about something called phospholipids later on. They're a component of a cell membrane. Hormones, steroid hormones, they're made up of lipids. Triglycerides, you probably heard that a little bit. Um, they're a lipid. And they have lots of functions, but I want you guys to remember the main function is long-term energy storage. They also provide some protection against heat loss, protection against water loss and germs. They're also chemical messengers, hormones and steroids, and they're a major component of membranes. And we know that a lot of times um, fats give us protection against heat loss, but we probably haven't heard anything about oils and waxes being a protection against water loss and germs. Um, I don't know if you've ever felt a plant, but sometimes, or felt a, I'm sorry, um, a waxy plant. It has that waxy coating on there to prevent water loss. That actually prevents it from something called transpiration, which is the evaporation of water through leaves. So if you put that waxy coating on there, it's harder to actually let that water evaporate. Germs, protection against germs. We have actually wax in our ears to prevent against infection. That wax actually prevents infection from occurring in our ear. Another type of protection that's really not listed here is we do have like a little patch of fat around our abdomens where we don't have, a lot of bones or um, protection for those internal organs, and that's where a lot of our major internal organs are. But we do have this little patch of fat, and everybody has it, and that protects us, um, or protects our internal organs from damage due to maybe bumping into something or we get into an accident, that will protect it, only so much, but it will protect it. How to identify lipids. And this is why I'm going over each element in there, because we're going to have to be able to identify lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids and carbohydrates from each other. Lipids, just like carbohydrates, contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, but they do not contain them in the 2-to-1 ratio, okay? So there's no ratio. Lipids normally have much, much less oxygen in them. Lipids actually do not have a true monomer. Lipids are grouped based on the fact that they are not water soluble. We cannot mix them with water. I don't know if you've ever tried or have seen water and oil mix. They don't. It'll normally, make these little globules or droplets up at the top of the water. They're also based on the fact that they contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, not in the 2-to-1 ratio. Proteins. Proteins have what we call amino acids as their building block. This is their monomer. This is what make them up. There are actually 2 kinds of amino acids. There are essential and non-essential amino acids. Essential amino acids can be synthesized by our body and or cannot be synthesized by our body and need to be obtained through our diet. There are 7 functions of proteins. There are lots of functions for proteins. We have storage, which proteins help us store. Transport, it says hemoglobin over here. You might not be familiar with the hemoglobin, but a hemoglobin is something that actually allows for transport of oxygen from your lungs to the rest of your body. We also have some regulatory with the hormones. Movement. I'm sure you've heard that proteins make up muscles, or you've heard them used together maybe when you're eating some meat. You need to get your protein in. When we're eating meat, more than likely we're eating, or we are eating an animal muscle. Structural, makes up membranes, enzymes. Cellular reactions take place, and then we have defense, which make up our antibodies, our immune system. But I really want you guys to remember this number 6, because that's going to be very important in this chapter, enzymes. Proteins. What are they good for? Some proteins control the rate of reactions and regulate cell processes. Some are used to form bones and muscles. Others transport substances into or out of the cell or help fight disease. And here we have proteins. Proteins make up amino acids. And here we have an amino acid. And a polymer would be a poly, meaning many, peptide chain. And that's just a fancy word for proteins because these amino acids are linked by something called peptide bonds. And linking many of them together, we get a polypeptide chain, many peptides linked together. How to identify proteins. Proteins contain carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen, okay? So we've got something new there. Here we have nitrogen. Enzymes, and like I said, there's a special protein out there called an enzyme. Enzymes are a special type of protein, and I really, really need you guys to remember this now. Enzymes speed up the rate of chemical reactions, okay? And the technical definition of this is enzymes speed up the rate of reactions by lowering the activation energy. We're going to talk a little bit more about this later on, but right now just remember they speed up the rate of chemical reactions. And our last macromolecule, nucleic acids. The function of a nucleic acid is, and nucleic acids are DNA and RNA. They contain the cell's genetic information, or they store and transmit genetic information. Nucleic acids, and that's probably maybe a new word for you. But we have two types. We have deoxyribose nucleic acid, which is DNA, and then we have ribonucleic acid, RNA. Nucleic acids are composed of long chains of nucleotides. So, since they're composed of these long chains of nucleotides, it would make sense that nucleic acids are made up of nucleotides. That's their monomer. And their polymer, or their is DNA and RNA strands. How do you identify nucleic acids? They contain the elements carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus. And they're the only macromolecule that contains phosphorus. Okay, and one thing that you need to learn now is what is a nucleotide made up of, and that, again, that's the monomer of the nucleic acid, and it's made up of three components: a phosphate group, a sugar, and a nitrogen base. And here we have our phosphate group, our sugar, and our nitrogen base, and this is the structure of a nucleotide. This is the monomer, or the building block, for the long strands of DNA and RNA. And this is what, a strand of the double helix, or a strand of DNA, would look like. Here we have one nucleotide bonding with another nucleotide, and here's another nucleotide right here, and another nucleotide right here, and here you'd have, a phosphate group and a sugar base, but you can't really see those from right here. Okay, so, and it also says at the bottom of your notes to copy down a chart, and this chart will help you identify macromolecules, which will be what you need to do in one of the other modules. So you might want to just pause that there and copy this chart down.